The old veteran was ignored by everyone, until a four-star general walked in and saluted him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The scene was set on a crisp, clear morning at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most hallowed grounds in the United States. The air was still, and a faint breeze rustled through the rows of white gravestones as a solemn ceremony was underway. The funeral of General Wallace, a decorated military hero, was being held, and only invited guests were allowed entry. Yet, standing just outside the main gates, an elderly man was about to face a confrontation that would change everything. The old man, John Miller, stood quietly in front of the gates, dressed in a simple, yet neat dark suit. His frame was frail, his hands trembled slightly as they rested at his sides. His face, weathered by time, seemed to carry the weight of countless memories, some painful, some full of pride. He did not speak a word, but simply gazed at the horizon, where the flags fluttered at half-mast in tribute to his fallen comrade. Two young guards stood at the entrance, arms crossed, their faces hard and unreadable. As the old man approached, one of the guards scoffed, stepping forward with a sharp, condescending voice. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his tone dripping with disdain. "This is a private funeral. You need to turn around and leave." The second guard stood silently by, his gaze scanning the street, unbothered by the exchange. John Miller said nothing. He didn't flinch at the words, his gaze remaining fixed on the distant hills beyond the gates. His silence seemed to irritate the young guard even more. "I said leave. Now," the first guard insisted, his voice rising. Miller still did not speak. Instead, his deep blue eyes flickered with a quiet determination that few could understand. The young guards exchanged a look before the first guard's expression twisted into something more mocking. "Look, Grandpa, we don't have time for this," the guard sneered. "This is a private event for important people. You're just in the way. There's another entrance a mile down that way if you want to visit the grave." Miller's eyes never wavered. He stood firm, his presence an unwavering calm in the midst of their aggression. "I'm here for General Wallace." Miller's voice was soft, but carried an unexpected weight. The second guard laughed, shaking his head. "Right, General Wallace. And I suppose you were his best friend too." The words were sharp, meant to belittle him. But the old man remained silent, his stoic demeanor unshaken. The guards continued to argue, their voices growing louder as they grew frustrated with the old man's refusal to move. A small crowd began to gather, curious onlookers whispering among themselves as they watched the standoff. Some of them cast sympathetic glances at Miller, but no one intervened. They all just watched in silence. The situation escalated quickly. The younger guard, whose name tag read Jennings, stepped forward, his stance now more aggressive. "You're causing a disturbance. We're going to have to ask you to leave, or we'll have to arrest you for trespassing," he threatened. Miller's eyes flickered briefly to the officer's face, then back to the distant hills. "I'm not leaving," Miller said quietly, his voice steady. The words hit the young guard like a thunderclap. Just as the situation seemed about to spiral into chaos, a third figure arrived, a young lieutenant, drawn to the commotion from a nearby checkpoint. He quickly assessed the situation, looking down at the elderly man before turning to the guards. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone flat and authoritative. "This man refuses to leave, sir," Jennings explained quickly. "He claims to be here for General Wallace, but he has no invitation, no credentials. He's causing a security problem." The lieutenant looked at Miller for a long moment, his gaze lingering on the old man's simple suit and unpolished shoes. The lieutenant's expression softened slightly, but the hard edges of military protocol remained in his voice. "Sir, this is a restricted area. You need to leave now, or I will have to place you under arrest for trespassing." Miller's heart tightened at the sound of the officer's words, but he did not flinch. Instead, he replied calmly, "I'm here for the general. He would have wanted me here." The lieutenant scoffed, clearly unconvinced. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. "I'm ordering you to leave." Just as he prepared to take action, something unexpected happened. A motorcade appeared in the distance, the sound of black vehicles growing louder. The tense air seemed to thicken, and the lieutenant's eyes darted toward the approaching convoy, his expression shifting from one of annoyance to concern. The convoy screeched to a halt just feet from the gate. Out stepped a group of officers, their uniforms immaculate, their faces grim and determined. The first figure to emerge was none other than General Peters, a four-star general known for his unwavering leadership. As he strode toward the gates, the guards froze. The lieutenant's face drained of color as he stood at attention. General Peters approached the scene with a deliberate, unhurried pace. He did not glance at the young guards or the lieutenant. His gaze landed only on the old man. With a sharp, precise motion, he raised his hand to his brow and delivered a salute so perfect, it sent a ripple of shock through everyone present. "Mr. Miller," General Peters said in a voice that cut through the silence. "It is an honor, sir." The guards, who moments ago had been mocking the elderly man, now stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with disbelief. The crowd gasped as the truth of the moment settled in. General Peters did not acknowledge the guards, nor did he speak further to the lieutenant. His focus was solely on Miller. The general's gaze softened with respect, and the entire cemetery seemed to fall silent as the weight of history unfolded before them. I will begin by noting that the old man, John Miller, stood silently as General Peters saluted him. The moment seemed to stretch on, with the entire crowd, the guards, and even the lieutenant frozen in place. General Peters' gesture was not just a simple act of respect. It was a confirmation of what the young guards had failed to see, a legacy that had been quietly carried through decades of sacrifice. The stillness in the air was thick with the weight of history, as the sounds of the cemetery faded into the background. The general's salute held a deep reverence, a powerful statement that made every person present realize the significance of the man before them. It wasn't just a symbol of military protocol. It was a reminder of the sacrifices made by soldiers who had lived and fought long before any of them were born. The silence was broken by the sound of a distant vehicle approaching. It wasn't just any vehicle. It was a convoy, moving swiftly, cutting through the air with a sense of purpose. The young guards, still standing stiffly, glanced nervously at one another. Their earlier mockery had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty and unease. General Peters, unhurried and deliberate, turned to face them. His eyes, hard as steel, locked with the lieutenant's, who had begun to realize the magnitude of the mistake. The general's next words, when they came, were measured and commanding. "You will stand down," he said quietly, but with enough force that no one doubted the power behind his words. The lieutenant, now pale, nodded without speaking, his posture immediately shifting from aggressive to apologetic. The crowd, still watching in stunned silence, shifted slightly, as if they, too, were waiting for the next chapter of this unfolding drama. The general turned back to Miller, his voice softening, but still holding that commanding presence. "Sir," he said, his tone filled with a deep respect, "you were a part of something far greater than any of us here could understand." John Miller, now feeling the full weight of the general's words, simply nodded. He had seen enough in his years to know that respect could be a long time coming, but when it arrived, it was worth every moment of waiting. The general's gaze never wavered as he continued. "It is an honor to have you here today. I owe you a debt that this nation can never repay." Miller's heart clenched at the words, but he kept his composure. He had never sought recognition for his actions, but hearing those words from a man of such high rank was a humbling experience. It was a confirmation of the life he had led, one of service, sacrifice, and quiet dedication. "You were there when it mattered most," General Peters continued, his voice echoing slightly in the still air. "And today, we recognize that. Today, we honor you." The words resonated in the air, carrying a weight that was palpable. The lieutenant, who had been caught in his own arrogance just moments ago, now found himself stepping back as the general's words landed heavily on his shoulders. The general turned back to the guards, his voice hardening. "You are to treat this man with the respect he deserves. No more insults. No more mockery." The guards, still processing the whirlwind turn of events, nodded quickly, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Miller, however, remained calm. He had lived through worse. This moment of recognition, however overdue, was not what mattered most. What mattered was the quiet bond forged in the heat of battle, the lives saved, the comrades lost. He didn't need medals, and he certainly didn't need anyone's validation. He only needed this moment, a moment where his past was acknowledged by someone who understood. As the general stepped aside, signaling for the ceremony to continue, the crowd began to murmur. People whispered in hushed tones, trying to process the spectacle they had just witnessed. Some of the older veterans, who had been watching from the back, now stood a little straighter, their eyes filled with a shared understanding. Miller's reputation had preceded him, but today, it was being given the recognition it had long been denied. The ceremony, which had been interrupted by the confrontation, resumed with a newfound reverence. The young guards, now properly humbled, stepped aside, allowing the elderly man to walk freely. And as Miller walked past them, his head held high, the crowd, for the first time, recognized the man they had overlooked. It wasn't just the guards or the spectators that had been humbled. It was the entire institution of respect, of honor, that had finally come to terms with its past. The legacy of the old veteran, once invisible, now stood tall among them, recognized by those who were fortunate enough to witness the full scope of his life. The ceremony continued, but the memory of that moment, of a general's salute to a man who had been overlooked, would live on long after the final words were spoken and the crowd had dispersed. Miller had become more than just a name from the past. He had become a symbol of the honor that was often forgotten in the rush of time. A symbol that would continue to stand as a reminder of the men and women who served in silence, only to be acknowledged when their stories could no longer be ignored. As the ceremony continued, the tension in the air began to ease. The initial shock of General Peters' unexpected arrival had subsided, and the atmosphere at Arlington National Cemetery shifted. The young guards, still standing at attention, were no longer the imposing figures they once were. Their faces were flush with embarrassment, their eyes now avoiding John Miller as if he had become something untouchable. Miller, however, moved on without a single glance at them, his steps slow but steady, as though he had walked this path many times before. Behind him, the crowd murmured softly, still processing the weight of the moment. Their respect for the elderly man had transformed from mere curiosity to something deeper, more genuine. As the general moved alongside him, the hum of whispers filled the air, but it was no longer directed at Miller with disdain. Now, it was admiration. They had seen the power of his presence, and they recognized that something much greater than a simple military ceremony was unfolding before them. The crowd was now fully aware that John Miller was no ordinary man. His story, though hidden in the shadows of time, was slowly beginning to reveal itself. General Peters' presence at his side spoke volumes. "Mr. Miller," General Peters spoke again, his voice now softer, yet still carrying an authority that commanded the attention of everyone present. "The nation owes you more than you will ever know. Today is just a small token of that respect." Miller gave the general a slight nod, but did not speak. His past had taught him that words often fell short in moments like this. He had lived a life where action spoke louder than anything he could say. As they continued their path toward the gravesite, a few of the older veterans in the crowd stood straighter. They recognized the old man now, but it wasn't just from his time in service. It was the unspoken bond they shared. The bond of those who had lived through the horrors of war and returned to a world that had moved on without them. But now, it seemed the world had come to them. As Miller reached the front of the line, he paused to take in the scene. His eyes locked onto the casket that lay just a few feet away, draped in the American flag. He could almost feel the weight of the decades pressing down on him, the memories of his own fallen comrades flooding back. But there was no bitterness in his heart, no anger. Only the quiet peace of a man who had done his duty, who had paid his price, and who now stood at the edge of history, surrounded by the ghosts of those who had gone before him. The general stepped up beside him, following Miller's gaze. "He was a great man," General Peters said, his voice tinged with sadness. "General Wallace was a hero in every sense of the word." Miller remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He had never sought recognition, but he understood the need for it. General Wallace had been his comrade, a man who had fought beside him in battles that the world would never fully understand. And now, that same world was honoring him. As the ceremony reached its climax, the sound of taps echoed through the cemetery, filling the air with a somber yet beautiful melody. The crowd stood in reverence, heads bowed in respect for the life that had been lived and the sacrifices that had been made. But for Miller, the true honor lay in the unspoken acknowledgement that now surrounded him. As the last notes of taps faded into the stillness of the morning, General Peters turned to the young guards who had once mocked Miller. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. The guards, still standing rigidly at attention, nodded in unison, their faces filled with regret. Miller, however, did not look back. He had nothing to prove. He had already given everything he needed to give. As he walked away, the sound of the general's voice calling him to stand tall echoed in his mind. The past was now behind him, but his story, his legacy, was far from forgotten. And as the crowd slowly began to disperse, the young lieutenant who had once tried to remove him from the ceremony watched in silence, his heart heavy with a newfound respect for the man he had once underestimated. As the ceremony came to a close, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their whispers now tinged with respect rather than mockery. The presence of General Peters had shifted the atmosphere, turning what had once been an ordinary military funeral into something much more profound. John Miller, the old veteran who had once been overlooked, now stood at the center of attention, not as an object of pity, but as a figure of reverence. The young guards, still stationed near the gates, watched him with a sense of awe that they hadn't felt before. They had never expected such a twist in their day, but it had happened, right before their eyes. As Miller walked away from the gravesite, General Peters remained by his side, his footsteps in perfect sync with the older man's. The general's expression was one of quiet pride. He had seen countless veterans in his career, but something about Miller's quiet dignity resonated with him on a deeper level. The ceremony had been about General Wallace, but now, in this moment, it had become about John Miller as well. The two men walked through the rows of gravestones, the sound of their boots crunching on the gravel, the only noise in the otherwise still air. The general finally spoke, his voice low, but filled with admiration. "You've lived a life that most can't even begin to understand, Mr. Miller," he said, his words carrying a weight that seemed to settle over them both. Miller's eyes remained fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. He had heard praise like this before, but it had never meant much. His service had always been about duty, not recognition. Still, hearing it from a man of the general's stature made him feel, for the first time in a long while, as if his sacrifices had not been in vain. "I did what I had to do," Miller replied quietly, his voice steady. "Just like the rest of us." The general nodded, understanding the humility in Miller's words. "But not everyone gets the respect they deserve, especially after all these years," Peters continued. "You were never the one to seek it out, but that doesn't mean it wasn't earned." Miller's face softened ever so slightly, though he still did not speak. The general, sensing that the old man was not one for many words, fell silent as well. They walked on in companionable silence, their steps slow and deliberate. As they approached the cemetery's exit, the sound of approaching vehicles caught their attention. A motorcade, but this time, it was not a ceremonial one. It was a convoy of military vehicles, their engines humming with purpose. The lead vehicle, a black SUV, slowed as it approached the gates. The vehicle stopped, and out stepped a man in a suit, his face grave, his eyes immediately locking onto Miller. "Sir," the man called, his voice tinged with urgency. "We need to speak with you." Miller stopped in his tracks, his expression unreadable. The general stepped forward, his hand raised to signal the man to approach. "What is it, Colonel?" Peters asked, his tone now serious. The colonel's gaze shifted from the general to Miller. He swallowed, his throat visibly tight. "We've been trying to locate you for some time, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "There's a matter that requires your immediate attention." Miller's brows furrowed, and for the first time in what felt like ages, a sense of uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady but with an edge of curiosity. The colonel hesitated for a moment, his eyes shifting nervously between the two men. "It's about your service record," he began. "There are questions that only you can answer." Miller stood tall, the weight of his years and experiences pressing down on him. His mind began to race, but he kept his composure. "I've answered enough questions," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What do you need to know?" The colonel paused again, as though unsure of how to proceed. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "We believe there's something you've been hiding, something that could change everything." The general's expression darkened, and he turned to Miller, his eyes searching the old man's face. "What is this about, Mr. Miller?" Peters asked quietly. Miller took a deep breath, the memories of his past flooding back in a rush. The things he had done, the things he had seen, were not stories he had ever shared. There were secrets buried deep within him, secrets that had been sealed away for a lifetime. He had always believed that some things were better left in the past. But now, as the colonel's words hung in the air, Miller knew that the past was no longer something he could ignore. "I'll tell you," he said, his voice steady. "But not here. Not now." The general nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The colonel, sensing the weight of Miller's words, stepped back, signaling for the convoy to move forward. "We'll follow you, sir," the colonel said, his tone respectful but with an urgency that could not be ignored. Miller turned, looking back at the cemetery one last time. His life had been a quiet one, filled with moments of service and sacrifice. But now, it seemed, his past was catching up to him. As the convoy sped away, Miller's heart raced. He did not know what lay ahead, but he knew that the time for silence was over. The truth, whatever it was, would soon come to light. And there was no turning back. The convoy continued to roll through the quiet streets, its engines a low hum in the stillness of the early afternoon. John Miller sat in the back of the vehicle, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, though his mind was miles away. He had never been one for ceremony or fanfare, but the events of the past few hours had shifted something deep within him. General Peters sat beside him, his expression thoughtful, but with a hint of something like concern in his eyes. The general had known veterans like Miller before, men who carried their stories in silence, men whose pasts were too heavy to speak about, but who carried their burdens with quiet dignity. Still, something in the air had changed. This wasn't just a simple matter of an old soldier being respected. It was clear that something far more significant was unfolding. The colonel in the front seat kept glancing back nervously, as if unsure how to approach the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Miller broke it. "You want to know what I've been hiding," he said, his voice gravelly and calm. "I'll tell you, but it's not something I've ever shared before. Not with anyone." The general turned toward him, his eyes steady. "I understand, Mr. Miller, and I won't press you. But whatever it is, know that you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Miller nodded, grateful for the general's understanding, but the weight of his past was still a heavy burden to bear. He looked out the window, his mind drifting back to the jungles of Vietnam, to a time when he was younger, when he was a soldier in the thick of things. The years had blurred the edges of those memories, but some moments remained crystal clear, like the day he first met General Wallace. They had been young officers then, both assigned to a covert operation deep in enemy territory. The mission had been risky, but that was nothing new. They had both seen their share of danger. But that day, when everything went sideways, it wasn't the enemy that posed the greatest threat. It was the weight of the decisions they had to make in the heat of battle. Miller had saved Wallace's life that day, pulling him out of a firefight that should have killed them both. He had done what any soldier would do for a comrade, but the price had been steep. He had lost his own men, his own team, in that same battle. And from that day forward, he carried their memories with him. The general had promised to repay him one day, but Miller had always refused to collect. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about duty, about brotherhood. As the vehicle neared the military base, Miller's thoughts turned back to the present. He had long ago made peace with the past, but he knew that peace was fragile. The truth, whatever it was about to be brought to light, and he wasn't sure how he would face it. The convoy pulled to a stop outside a large building, the headquarters of the military installation. The air was thick with anticipation. Miller could feel the tension building in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He had faced far worse than this. The general gave him a reassuring look before stepping out of the vehicle. "Come on, Mr. Miller," he said. "Let's get this over with." Miller followed him, his boots heavy on the ground as they made their way into the building. The colonel led them through a series of halls, eventually stopping in front of a closed door. The colonel knocked lightly before opening it, revealing a small group of high-ranking officers inside. They all turned to look at Miller as he entered. "Gentlemen," General Peters said, his voice commanding. "This is John Miller, the man whose name you've been looking for." The officers stood in silence, their eyes scanning Miller, as if trying to piece together the man behind the legend. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice measured but with an edge of curiosity. "We've been trying to locate you for some time. There are matters we need to discuss regarding your service." Miller stood still, his posture straight but his mind racing. The general had known there was something more to his story, but now it seemed like the time had come to reveal it. The tall officer motioned for the others to sit. "Please, take a seat, Mr. Miller," he said. "We need to go over some details. It's important." Miller sat, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent, the weight of the moment settling over them all. General Peters remained standing, his gaze fixed on Miller, offering him a silent sense of support. "What you're about to hear," the officer continued, "is classified information. It's a matter of national security." Miller's expression didn't change, but his mind was now alert, the old soldier in him recognizing the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about him anymore. "I understand," he said quietly. "What do you need from me?" The officer paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "We need you to confirm some details. About the operation you were involved in back in 1968. The mission where you saved General Wallace." Miller felt a pang in his chest. The memories flooded back again, but this time, there was no escaping them. He had always thought those days were behind him, buried in the past. But now, it seemed like the past was coming back to demand answers. "I can tell you what happened," Miller said slowly. "But know this, I was just doing my job. I wasn't a hero. I just did what needed to be done." The officer nodded, as if he understood. "We've been piecing together reports, and there are discrepancies. Your name has come up, but we need confirmation of your actions." Miller leaned forward, his eyes locking with the officer's. "I'll tell you what happened, but I don't need anyone's validation. I did what I had to do, and that's all that matters." The officer remained silent for a moment, as if weighing Miller's words. Finally, he spoke. "We know, Mr. Miller, and that's why we're here." The room was silent as John Miller sat across from the group of high-ranking officers, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, his eyes steady, but his mind racing. He had known the day would come when he would be forced to confront his past, but he had always hoped that day would stay far behind him. Now, as the officers sifted through the pages of his past, there was no escaping it. The officer who had spoken earlier, the tall one with the stern face, continued to study him, his expression unreadable. The weight of the moment was heavy, but Miller refused to let it show. "Mr. Miller," the officer began, his voice low and precise, "we've been reviewing the mission in 1968, the one where you saved General Wallace. The details surrounding your involvement are crucial to national security, especially in light of what has been uncovered recently." Miller's gaze never wavered. He had been through this before. Not the specifics of this mission, but the questioning, the probing. It was something he had gotten used to over the years, though he had always avoided it. "I already told you," Miller replied slowly, his voice calm and firm. "I did my job. I saved him. That's what happened." The officer nodded, but there was an unspoken question lingering in the air. Miller could feel it, the weight of what they were really asking. "You don't understand," the officer continued. "This isn't just about the past. There are people, powerful people, who have been looking for the truth behind that mission. They believe there's more to the story than what we've been told." Miller's expression darkened. "I told you what happened. That's all you need to know." He had kept so many secrets for so long. Things he had seen, things he had done. It was all buried deep inside him. There was no reason to bring it all back to the surface. The officer looked at him with a mixture of respect and caution. "We know, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice softening. "But the truth is, the people who need to know, need to understand what really happened. There are still unfinished matters that only you can clarify." Miller stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm done here," he said, his tone final. "There's nothing more to say. If you want the truth, then you'll have to dig it up somewhere else." General Peters, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice low but firm. "I know this isn't easy, but sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us. And when it does, there's no running from it." Miller turned to face. Him, the lines on his face hardening. He had lived a life that few could understand, and he had always believed that the past was a place to leave behind. But now, as the general's words sank in, Miller knew there was no avoiding what was coming. The general's voice softened, a rare vulnerability creeping into his words. "You don't have to face this alone," he said quietly. "We're here to help. Whatever it is, whatever you've been carrying, we'll figure it out together." Miller looked at the general, his old comrade, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something. Trust, maybe, or at least the hope that he wasn't entirely alone in this. The officer who had been sitting at the table spoke up again, his voice steady, but with a hint of urgency. "Sir, we need to know everything. The mission you were part of, it wasn't just a mission. It was the beginning of something much bigger. We've been following the trail for years, and now, everything points to you. There's a larger conspiracy at play, and it's one that you're intimately tied to." Miller's heart raced. He had heard rumors over the years, whispers about unfinished business, about things that had been buried. But he never thought they would come for him, not after all this time. "What exactly are you asking me?" Miller's voice was low, his fists clenched by his sides. "We need you to help us understand why you were there that day, why you were the one who was chosen for that mission. It's all connected to something much bigger than any of us. And you're the only one left who can piece it all together." Miller took a deep breath, the weight of the officer's words settling over him. For a moment, he stood in silence, the years of buried memories rising to the surface. He had known, deep down, that he couldn't hide from it forever. The truth was waiting for him, and it was demanding to be told. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but filled with the weight of what was to come. "I'll tell you what happened," he said quietly. "But you need to understand, what I'm about to say changes everything. It's not just about the mission anymore. It's about the men we lost, the things we did to survive. It's about a world that most people never saw, a world that I never wanted anyone to see." The room fell silent as the officers leaned in, their eyes fixed on Miller. He had been waiting for this moment, though he had never been ready for it. The past was about to be revealed, and there was no turning back. With a deep breath, Miller began to speak, his voice steady but filled with the weight of a lifetime's worth of secrets. The room was silent as John Miller began to recount the story that had been buried for so long, a story that he had carried with him through years of quiet torment and unspoken pain. The officers listened intently, their eyes fixed on him, their bodies leaning forward as if waiting for something to shift. General Peters, standing to one side, watched Miller with a mix of respect and concern, his face betraying none of the emotions that flickered beneath. Miller's voice was steady but tinged with a rawness that only those who had lived through the worst of it could understand. "It all started in 1968, a few miles south of the Asha Valley," he began, his mind drifting back to the heat of battle, to the roar of gunfire and the chaos of the jungle. "We were sent in on a mission that was supposed to be quick, clean, and easy. We were just a few miles from the base, but things went south in a heartbeat." He paused for a moment, the weight of the memory pressing down on him. "We were supposed to scout out enemy positions, maybe hit a small supply line. Nothing major. But when we got there, we found something else." Miller's eyes darkened as he continued. "There was an entire battalion of enemy soldiers. More than we were told. We were outnumbered 5-1, and the mission was a trap. We tried to fall back, but we were pinned down in the middle of the jungle. That's when Wallace got hit." He took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the floor. "General Wallace and I had served together before, but this time, he was the one who needed saving. He took a hit to the shoulder, bad enough that he couldn't move. We couldn't afford to stay, but I couldn't leave him behind either." Miller's hands tightened into fists at his sides as the memories rushed back, the sounds, the fear, the realization that they were not going to make it out alive. "I dragged him through the mud, through the rain. He was heavy, even for a man his size. But I had to get him to safety. I couldn't just leave him there. We were already out of radio range, and I knew we couldn't call for help." The officers sat in complete silence, their faces betraying no emotion, but the tension in the room was palpable. General Peters stepped forward, his voice calm, yet commanding. "You saved him," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on Miller. "And yet, you're here, telling us that it wasn't enough, that you've been hiding something." Miller's eyes flickered for a moment, and then he looked up at the general, his voice steady but laced with years of unspoken anguish. It wasn't enough, he said. It wasn't just Wallace I had to save. There were others who didn't make it. I don't even know how I survived, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let their sacrifices go unnoticed. He turned his gaze to the officers in the room, his eyes hardening. But there's more to the story. Things that weren't in the report, things they never told you. The mission wasn't just a simple trap. It was a cover-up. The room felt even quieter. The general's face didn't change, but the tension in the air grew thicker, and the officers exchanged glances, their minds racing. Miller continued, his voice low but intense. We were sent to destroy a supply line, yes. But what they didn't tell us was that there were prisoners involved. American prisoners. The officers froze. This was not something they had anticipated. We were sent to destroy their supply lines, but we found something else. We found our own men, left behind, and the orders we were given weren't to rescue them. They were to eliminate them. Miller's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the weight of the betrayal still fresh after all these years. I couldn't do it. I couldn't just leave them there, not when I knew we could save them. So, I made a choice. I ignored orders, and I brought them back. All of them. We managed to get out, but not without a price. He paused, his eyes flickering to the floor as the officers processed what he had just revealed. The truth is, I didn't save them all. We lost too many along the way. But I couldn't leave any more behind. I couldn't stand by and let them die. The officer who had been silent up until this point finally spoke, his voice tense. And General Wallace? What happened to him? Miller's gaze met his. Wallace didn't know what was going on. I didn't tell him the full story, but he knew I was doing something. He knew I wasn't just trying to get him to safety. He took a breath, his face hardening once more. And that's when I made my biggest mistake. I kept quiet. I never told anyone about what really happened. The truth was too dangerous. So I buried it. And I've lived with it ever since. The silence in the room was thick, each officer processing what Miller had just revealed. General Peters, who had been standing quietly to one side, stepped forward. Mr. Miller, he said, his voice filled with respect, you've carried this burden for too long. You were never meant to carry it alone. This story, this truth, is part of our history, and it will be told. Miller shook his head, a slight but knowing smile on his lips. I've told you the truth, he said. Now it's up to you to decide what happens next. The general nodded, his eyes never leaving Miller's face. We'll make sure it's heard. You don't have to hide anymore. With that, the weight of the past seemed to lift slightly from Miller's shoulders, and though the story wasn't over, he knew it was no longer his to bear alone. The room remained heavy with silence after Miller had finished speaking, his words lingering in the air like smoke from a long-dead fire. The officers were still processing the gravity of what he had revealed, the truth of a mission that had been buried for years. General Peters, standing by the door, watched the scene unfold with a quiet intensity, knowing that this moment would change everything. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It wasn't just about the lives lost or the secrets hidden away. It was about a man who had carried a weight for far too long, a weight that no one had understood until now. The officer who had been questioning Miller was the first to break the silence, his voice low but filled with urgency. Mr. Miller, he began, the implications of what you've said are vast. We had no idea. Miller didn't respond at first. Instead, he stared at the floor, his hands resting on his knees. The general had already heard the story, but the officers in the room hadn't. And now that they had, there was no turning back. What happens now? The officer asked, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and disbelief. General Peters stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We move forward, he said simply. We bring this story to light. It's time for the truth to be known. The officer nodded slowly, his face hardening with resolve. And what of the cover-up? The conspiracy you mentioned? Miller's eyes flickered, but he didn't answer right away. He had spent years running from the past, avoiding the people who might still be looking for him. He had made peace with his demons, or at least he had tried to. But now, as the walls closed in, he knew that he couldn't hide any longer. We can't ignore it, Miller finally said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. The conspiracy, it's real. There are people who will stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had suspected something larger was at play, but hearing it from Miller, a man who had lived through it, brought it to a whole new level of seriousness. Do you think they'll come after you? one of the officers asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miller didn't flinch. He had been asking himself that very question for years. They already have, he said quietly. But I'm not running anymore. The general nodded, a sense of pride creeping into his features. Good. We're not running either. He turned to the rest of the officers, his gaze steady. We've all known about the cover-ups, the lies. But now we have a choice. We can bury this like it's been buried for years, or we can make sure the truth is told. And we will make sure it's told. The officers nodded in unison. They had seen the proof. They had heard the story. Now it was time to act. What do you need from us? The officer who had spoken earlier asked. Miller stood up, his posture straightening. As he gathered his thoughts, we need to gather everything, he said, his voice determined. I need to go over the mission again, piece by piece. We need the full report, everything that was covered up. The men who were lost, the ones who survived, we need to know what happened to them. General Peters placed a hand on Miller's shoulder, his touch firm but reassuring. We'll help you. We'll make sure it's all documented, every detail. Miller nodded, grateful for the support. But he knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The past had a way of resurfacing when you least expected it, and the truth always had a way of demanding more than you were prepared to give. As they left the room, the weight of what had just begun settled on Miller's shoulders. He had spent years avoiding this moment, but now that it had arrived, he couldn't turn away. The truth was out there, and it would be told, no matter the cost. As they made their way down the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoing in the empty space, Miller couldn't help but wonder what would come next. There would be no turning back now. The story was no longer his alone. It was bigger than that. It always had been. But as the general walked beside him, their steps in perfect sync, Miller couldn't help but feel, for the first time in years, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this fight. And that was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. The next few days moved with a sense of urgency that Miller hadn't felt in years. The world had shifted, and now he was caught in its relentless current, pulled back into a battle he thought had been settled long ago. The officers and General Peters worked tirelessly to gather the missing pieces of the puzzle, combing through declassified files and piecing together the fragments of the mission that had been erased from the official record. Miller knew every moment they spent digging into the past was another moment closer to the people who would do anything to silence them. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. General Peters had put together a team of trusted officers, and together, they formed an unlikely alliance. Each one of them had their own reasons for taking part in this fight, but they all shared the same goal, uncovering the truth. Miller's role in the mission and his decision to save the prisoners had been swept under the rug for decades. He had never sought recognition, but now, as the pieces of the story were brought to light, he began to understand just how deeply the cover-up had been woven into the fabric of military operations. It wasn't just about one mission. It was about a systemic betrayal, one that had left countless lives in the shadows. Miller had always known that there were dark corners of the military where things went unspoken, where people like him, like the soldiers he served with, were forgotten. But he had never realized how far-reaching the conspiracy was. The more they uncovered, the more he realized that the truth had been buried to protect those who were supposed to be held accountable. We're getting close, General Peters said one afternoon, as he stood in the conference room, looking over the mountain of documents. The room was quiet, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on them all. We've confirmed the identities of the prisoners that were left behind, and we've got names of the officers who were involved in the cover-up. But it's the higher-ups we need to worry about. Miller's heart tightened. He had known this moment would come. The people at the top, the ones who orchestrated the silence, would stop at nothing to prevent the truth from coming to light. What are we going to do? Miller asked, his voice steady but laced with caution. The general turned to him, his expression hardening. We take it to the public, he said, his voice unwavering. We expose them. We make sure that everyone knows what happened. Miller knew the risks, but he also knew that there was no other way. The men who had died that day in the jungle, his comrades, his brothers, deserved justice. And so did the men he had saved. We can't wait any longer, Miller said. If we keep dragging this out, they'll find a way to shut us down. The general nodded in agreement. We're ready. We've got the evidence. It's time. The decision was made, and the team quickly moved into action. They prepared their case, compiling everything they had uncovered. The officers who had been complicit in the cover-up were named, their roles laid bare for the world to see. But they knew that exposing this level of corruption would make them targets. Miller had been ready for this moment, but he still felt the weight of it pressing on him. The stakes had never been higher. As they prepared to go public with their findings, Miller's thoughts turned back to that day in the jungle. The mission had been more than just a mission. It had been a turning point in his life, a moment that had defined everything that had come after. And now, the truth about that day was finally going to be heard. General Peters briefed the press, standing tall before the cameras with Miller by his side. The journalists were eager for answers, and as the general spoke, Miller watched the faces of the crowd shift from curiosity to disbelief. They had known there were secrets, but they hadn't known the extent of them. As the details of the cover-up were laid bare, Miller could feel the eyes of the world on him. But he didn't flinch. He had carried the burden of silence for too long. Now, it was time for the world to hear the truth. The response was swift. The fallout was immediate. The higher-ups who had been involved in the cover-up tried to discredit the story, but the evidence was irrefutable. Public outrage spread like wildfire, and the pressure mounted on the military to take action. It wasn't long before the first of the implicated officers was brought to trial. Miller watched the proceedings from a distance, his heart heavy with a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. This was justice, but it was justice that came too late. The men who had lost their lives, the prisoners who had been left behind, would never see the outcome of this trial. But Miller knew that the truth had finally come to light, and that was something they could never take away. As the trials continued, Miller found himself reflecting on the past, on the decisions he had made, and on the men who had served alongside him. He had never asked for recognition, but he had always known that he had done what was right. Now, that truth was out there for the world to see. The world was changing, and for the first time in his life, Miller felt that the weight of his past was finally beginning to lift. The fight wasn't over, but the truth had been set free. And for Miller, that was enough. The world outside seemed to move in slow motion as the trial proceedings continued. The courtroom was packed with reporters, military officials, and civilians, all eager to see the outcome of a case that had shaken the foundation of the military establishment. John Miller sat quietly in the back of the room, his hands clasped together, his eyes focused on the defendant in the dock. An officer who had once been a part of the operation he had led, now accused of covering up the truth. The charges were serious, the stakes were high, but for Miller, this was just another chapter in a long, painful journey. As the trial progressed, more details about the cover-up emerged, each revelation adding weight to the case against the higher-ups involved. The courtroom buzzed with tension as evidence was presented, and Miller could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The truth was finally being heard, but the journey was far from over. The prosecution's case was strong, but the defense, as expected, fought back with all they had. They tried to discredit Miller, to paint him as a man driven by guilt and revenge. They argued that his actions had been reckless, that the lives lost in the operation were the result of his disobedience and his failure to follow orders. But Miller didn't flinch. He had already made peace with his choices, and he knew the truth would come out eventually. As the days dragged on, Miller felt a growing sense of unease. The trial was moving forward, but the higher-ups who had orchestrated the cover-up had not been brought to trial yet. They were still in power, still pulling the strings from behind the scenes, and Miller knew that as long as they were free, the truth would always be under threat. One evening, as he sat in his hotel room, General Peters called him. "Miller," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "We need to talk." Miller's heart sank. "What is it, General?" he asked, his voice steady. "It's about the trial," the general replied. "We've hit a roadblock. There's someone pulling strings behind the scenes. We can't prove it yet, but it's clear that there are people in high places trying to shut this down." Miller stood up, his heart racing. He had expected this. He had known that the fight wasn't over. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice low but resolute. "We keep pushing," General Peters said, his tone firm. "We expose them. If we let them get away with this, it will be over for good. We can't let them win." Miller nodded, his resolve hardening. The truth was on the verge of being buried again, but he couldn't let that happen. The next few days were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and sleepless nights. General Peters and his team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, and pushing the case forward. But the shadow of the conspiracy still loomed large. It wasn't just about the trial anymore. It was about everything they had fought for, everything that had been hidden for so long. On the final day of the trial, as the defense delivered its closing argument, Miller stood up. He had been silent for days, but now it was time to speak. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as he approached the stand. "I didn't do this for glory," he said, his voice strong, though there was a tremor in it. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. And I'm here because I want the truth to be heard. The men I fought with, the men who died, they deserve to have their stories told. They deserve justice." The room was still as he spoke, every word hanging in the air. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had carried this burden for too long, and now, it was time to let it go. "I made choices," Miller continued, his voice steady. "I saved who I could, and I lived with the consequences. But the ones who died, they didn't deserve to be forgotten. And that's why I'm here." He looked around the courtroom, meeting the eyes of the officers, the journalists, and the civilians who had come to witness the trial. "This is bigger than me. This is bigger than any of us. This is about making sure the truth doesn't get buried again." He sat back down, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done everything he could. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but when the verdict came, it was clear. The case against the officers who had been involved in the cover-up was too strong. They were found guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Miller felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't over, not yet. There were still people in power who needed to be held accountable. But for the first time in years, Miller could feel a sense of justice. He had fought for this moment, and though it had come with a price, he knew that the truth was finally being heard. As he walked out of the courtroom, General Peters by his side, Miller felt the eyes of the world on him. The battle wasn't over, but for now, he had won. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. The days that followed the trial were a blur of media attention and press conferences. The truth had finally come to light, and the world was watching. The officers involved in the cover-up were facing the consequences of their actions, but the ripple effects were far-reaching. For Miller, it felt like the past had come alive, the ghosts of the men he had lost, the secrets he had carried, now demanding their place in history. As the media storm intensified, Miller found himself back in the quiet corners of his mind, reflecting on what had been and what was yet to come. He had fought for this moment, for justice, for the truth to be heard. But now, as the applause died down and the world moved on to the next big story, he was left with an uneasy silence. General Peters had been by his side throughout the ordeal, offering support, guidance, and a steady presence that Miller had come to rely on. The general's face had been stoic throughout the trial, but now, after the verdict, there was a sense of relief in his eyes. He had known the weight of this moment, the significance of what Miller had done. But now, it was time for the world to move forward. "You did it," General Peters said one evening as they sat in the small office at the military base, the faint hum of activity just outside the door. "We did it," Miller corrected him, his voice steady but tinged with something else. Something like exhaustion, mixed with a quiet pride. The general nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "True. But you were the one who stood up. You were the one who faced the truth, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet." Miller exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. Because it had to be done." "I know," Peters replied, his voice soft. "But sometimes, doing the right thing comes with a price. And you've paid it." The words hung in the air, and Miller didn't respond immediately. He had paid the price, that much was true. He had lost comrades, friends, and so many years carrying a burden that no one had understood. But now, with the truth finally out there, he wondered if it had been worth it. "What happens now?" Miller asked, breaking the silence. The general's eyes softened, as if he could sense the weight of the question. "We rebuild," he said simply. "We make sure the truth isn't buried again. We hold those responsible accountable, and we make sure no one else has to carry the same burden you did." Miller nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The truth had been revealed, but the world was not yet ready to fully accept it. He could already feel the pushback coming, the resistance from those who had built their careers on lies. "It's never over, is it?" Miller said softly, more to himself than to the general. Peters didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze intense. No, it's never over, he said. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. We keep going, because that's what we do. We don't give up. We keep moving forward. Miller met the general's eyes, the weight of his words settling in. It wasn't over. It would never be over. The past was always going to haunt him, but now, he had the strength to face it. He had fought for the truth, and while the battle had been won, there were still many more fights ahead. Thank you, Miller said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. The general nodded, his expression unreadable. You don't owe me anything, Miller. You did what needed to be done. Now it's time to live your life. Miller stood up, his heart heavy, but his mind clearer than it had been in years. The truth had come to light, and the world had taken notice. But as he walked out of the office and into the cool evening air, he knew that his journey was far from over. The fight for justice was ongoing, and he was just one soldier in a much larger war. As he stood outside, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if offering some form of hope. For the first time in a long time, Miller felt that he could finally breathe. The road ahead would be long, but it was his to walk. And for the first time in years, he wasn't walking alone. In the weeks that followed, the public response to the trial and its revelations was nothing short of overwhelming. The media coverage intensified, with headlines splashed across every major outlet, detailing the cover-up and the bravery of the men who had brought the truth to light. John Miller, however, remained largely out of the spotlight. Despite the recognition he had earned, he was no longer interested in the attention. His battle had never been for glory, and now that it was over, he found himself seeking peace, something that had been in short supply for most of his life. General Peters, who had stood by him through the entire process, now found himself more and more in the public eye. Interviews, press conferences, and private briefings became a routine part of his life, but Miller could see that the general was handling it with the same quiet strength that had always defined him. Yet, despite all the external success, something gnawed at Miller. The world had finally acknowledged the truth, but there were still shadows in his mind. Memories of the men he had lost, the comrades who had given their lives in a war they could barely comprehend. He had done what needed to be done, but now he found himself struggling with a new kind of weight. What was next? What came after truth had been revealed, after justice had been served? He had spent so many years running from his past, from the secrets he had kept buried, that now, with it all laid bare, he felt a strange emptiness. He had fought for these moments of truth, but now that they had arrived, he wasn't sure how to move forward. General Peters, sensing that Miller was lost in thought, came to visit him one afternoon. Miller was sitting by the window, looking out over the quiet street. "You've been quiet lately," Peters remarked, taking a seat across from him. "More so than usual." Miller smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Just thinking," he said, his voice low. "About everything. About what happens now." The general nodded, as if he understood the weight Miller was feeling. "It's a lot to process," he said. "The world sees you differently now. They see the man who did what needed to be done when everyone else turned away. But I know it's not that simple for you." Miller looked up, meeting the general's eyes. "It's never that simple," he replied. "I did what I had to do, but I didn't do it for anyone but the men I fought with. And now that it's all out there, I feel like, I don't know, like there's nothing left to fight for." General Peters leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "There's always something left to fight for, Miller. The fight doesn't end when the truth is out. The fight is in how you live with it, how you make sure it doesn't get buried again." Miller nodded slowly. He had always known that the fight for justice was never a one-time event. It was ongoing, a battle that never truly ended. But the realization that he had played his part, that he had fought for the truth, gave him a strange sense of closure. "Maybe I'm just tired," Miller said quietly. "I've carried this weight for so long, I don't know how to put it down." Peters studied him for a moment, then spoke, his voice firm. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore. You never did. You've got people who understand, people who are ready to stand by you. And it's time for you to let go of that burden. You've earned your peace." The words settled over Miller like a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he realized that maybe he could put the past behind him. Maybe it was time to stop fighting battles that had already been won. As the days passed, Miller found himself slowly coming to terms with the new chapter in his life. He had done what needed to be done. The truth had been told, and the men who had fought beside him had been given the recognition they deserved. But now, it was time to move forward. He had lived through the worst, and now, he had the chance to live for something more. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Miller felt like he could face it without the weight of the past holding him back. He would always carry the memories of his fallen comrades, but he no longer needed to carry the guilt, the shame, or the burden of silence. With General Peters by his side, Miller took the first steps into this new life. It wasn't going to be easy, but it would be his to shape, and for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to do so. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. The future was his to live, and for the first time, Miller felt the peace he had fought so hard to find. As the months passed, life began to settle into a rhythm that Miller had not experienced in years. The trial was behind him, the media storm had subsided, and the truth was no longer something he had to hide. But even with all the recognition, all the justice, there was still something that gnawed at him. The faces of his fallen comrades, the men he had fought alongside, still haunted his every step. The weight of their loss, the price they had paid for the mission that had never been properly acknowledged, still weighed heavily on him. Yet, as time went on, Miller began to feel a shift within himself. The burden of silence, the years of carrying secrets, had started to ease. He had done what needed to be done. He had brought the truth to light. And in doing so, he had helped lay the foundation for a change that was bigger than any one man. The world had been forced to reckon with the past, to confront the hidden truths that had been buried for far too long. But now, as the dust settled, Miller realized that the fight was not over. It would never truly be over. The men who had fought beside him would always be part of him. Their stories would continue to live on in his mind and his heart. And he would carry their memories with him, not as a burden, but as a legacy. General Peters had stepped back into the shadows of his own life, his role in the mission now complete. But Miller knew that the general had been more than just a leader to him. He had been a friend, someone who had stood by him when the world had turned its back. And as the days passed, Miller came to realize that the friendship they had formed over the years was one of the greatest gifts he had received. They had fought together, side by side, in a battle that had tested them both in ways they could never have imagined. And now, they both understood that the real fight was not about winning or losing. It was about standing together, about holding on to the principles that made them who they were. One quiet evening, as the sun began to set over the small town where Miller had taken refuge, he stood outside, looking out over the horizon. The world was vast, and for the first time in a long time, he felt small in it. But not in a bad way. It was the feeling of knowing that he had finally done something worthwhile. He had stood up for what was right. He had fought for the truth. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The next morning, Miller found himself sitting in a small diner, a cup of coffee in hand, his eyes lost in thought. He had spent so many years running, so many years buried in the past, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply exist in the present. But now, as the days stretched ahead of him, he could feel a new sense of possibility opening up. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he was ready to find out. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, the door to the diner opened, and in walked a man he hadn't seen in years, Colonel Richardson, a former comrade from the old days. Richardson had been one of the men Miller had saved during the mission, one of the prisoners who had been left behind and rescued in the aftermath of the operation. He had always been grateful to Miller for that, but Miller had never expected to see him again. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, neither knew what to say. But then, Richardson smiled, a smile that was both weary and genuine. "You've got a lot of nerve, you know that?" Richardson said with a chuckle as he slid into the booth across from Miller. Miller raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Richardson leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "I've been hearing about you. What you did. What you've been through." He shook his head in disbelief. "You're one hell of a man, Miller." Miller looked at him for a moment, the words hanging between them. He hadn't expected this kind of recognition, especially not from someone who had been there, who had seen the worst of it all. "I didn't do it for the recognition," Miller replied quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, because it was something that needed to be done." Richardson nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I know. We all know. But that doesn't make it any less extraordinary. The two men sat in silence for a moment, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Then, finally, Richardson spoke again. I just wanted to thank you for saving my life, for saving all of us. Miller's chest tightened at the words, but he didn't speak. The truth was, he hadn't needed to hear the thanks. He had done what he had done because it was his duty, because it was what any man would do for his brothers. But hearing it now, after all these years, it made the weight of the past feel a little lighter. You don't have to thank me, Miller said finally, his voice steady. We all did what we had to do. Richardson smiled again, a little wistfully. I suppose we did. The two men sat in silence, each of them reflecting on the years that had passed, on the things they had seen, and the sacrifices they had made. But in that moment, Miller understood that the true value of what they had done wasn't in the recognition or the awards. It was in the lives they had saved, in the bonds they had formed, and in the fact that, despite everything, they were still here, still standing. The world had changed, but Miller knew that the one thing that would never change was the loyalty and the brotherhood they had fought for. And that, in the end, was all that truly mattered.